This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chairman is authorized to declare a recess at any time. And before I deliver my opening remarks, I want to note that today the committee is meeting both in person and virtually. And I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this hearing. First, members and staff who are attending in person may choose to be masked, but it is not a requirement. However, any individual's symptoms, a positive test, or exposure to someone with COVID-19 should wear a mask while present. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. And finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. So good morning, and welcome to today's hearing, Exploring Cyberspace, Understanding Cybersecurity Issues for Civil and Commercial Space Systems. I want to welcome our witnesses, both in person and virtual. We're pleased to have you with us. Getting to space and operating there involves risk. From the launch itself to micrometeoroids, orbital debris, and geomagnetic storms, space system developers and operators must mitigate against multiple risks that can impact their satellites. But today's hearing focuses on a much more nefarious risk, cyber threats to civil and commercial space systems. These risks have taken a center stage since the public announcement of a malicious Russian attack in February 2002 on Viasat's satellite internet user modems. The hack affected thousands of customers in Ukraine and tens of thousands across Europe. Other reports cited jamming of Starlink's space broadband ground terminals, which were sent to Ukraine when its communications were disrupted by the Russian invasion. While the recent hacks have highlighted the issue, cyber threats to space systems are not new. In 2015, the congressionally established U.S.-China Economic Security and Review Commission reported on hacks in 2007 and 2008 to the Landsat 7 satellite. The Commission also noted that cyber actors targeted NASA's Terra Earth observation satellite on 2 occasions in 2008. The actors demonstrated, quote, the steps required to command the satellite, unquote, but did not do so. In 2014, a cyber attack on the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's NOAA's Satellite Information and Weather Service systems actually led the agency to stop satellite transmission of weather data to the National Weather Service for 2 days while it responded to the incident. These hacks perpetrated by bad actors are chilling and serious. The importance of addressing them is amplified as our reliance on space for in-space and terrestrial infrastructure and services continues to grow. As examples, NOAA plans to procure space situational awareness data from commercial providers, and NASA plans to procure commercial space-based communication services to meet many of its communications requirements. To date, the government and Congress have taken steps to address the matter. In December 2020, the government issued Space Policy Directive 5, Cybersecurity Principles for Space Systems. In May 2021, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, myself, and Ranking Member Babin requested that the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, conduct a review of the cybersecurity risks to the sensitive data associated with NASA's major projects and spaceflight operations. That review is now underway. Other members of Congress have introduced legislative proposals on space and cybersecurity. More recently, following the Viasat incident, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the FBI issued an alert on strengthening cybersecurity of satellite communication network providers and customers. The National Security Agency also issued a cybersecurity advisory to protect small ground terminals used to transmit and receive satellite communications. And the Department of Commerce's National Institute of Standards and Technology has issued guidance on cybersecurity for commercial space systems. Today's hearing will give us an opportunity to review these efforts and the overall landscape of cybersecurity for civil and commercial space systems, including what is the range of threats today, what is the status of the implementation of Space Policy Directive 5, what role should the federal government have, and is there an agency in charge of space cybersecurity, and what are the issues for Congress? We need to make every effort to understand what further actions can be and should be taken to strengthen cybersecurity for civil and commercial space systems, including commercial space systems that provide mission-critical government data and services. Malicious disruptions to such systems would have significant impacts to critical services, our economy, and the growing $447 billion global space economy. including everything from weather and environmental forecasting to forestry management, communications, space science, and national security. I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses on this important issue. And before I close, I want to note the groundbreaking progress that will be made with the House's voting on the Senate-passed CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. This act includes the first NASA authorization in 5 years. And I think I'm very proud that this NASA authorization includes many of the changes, the recommendations from both the GAO report on NASA and the Inspector General report on NASA. The core set of provisions provide direction across NASA's portfolio that will support the agency in continuing to lead, inspire, discover, explore, and carry out ambitious and challenging space and aeronautics missions. Let me now turn to my friend, the good doctor from Houston, and the ranking member, Mr. Babbitt.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer. I really appreciate that very much. Good morning. Thanks for holding this important hearing. We've held a number of hearings on space cybersecurity over the last several years, and unfortunately learned of many cybersecurity incidents related to civil and commercial space. The 2011 U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission report to Congress indicated that hackers interfered with USGS's Landsat 7 satellite in October of 2007 and also in July of 2008. And NASA's Terra satellite in June of 2008 and October of 2008. In 2014, we also learned of intrusions into NOAA's weather and satellite network. A 2019 report from the NASA IG indicated that NASA information technology security managers remain concerned about potential infiltration into NASA's spaceflight systems to acquire launch codes and flight trajectories of spacecraft. More recently, senior NASA officials stated that the hack of SolarWinds software was a big wake-up call. Just a few months ago, Secretary of State issued a formal statement attributing a cyber attack on a commercial satellite communication network to Russia. With the proliferation of commercial space operations and NASA's increased use of commercial services, this hearing is a timely update on the topic of cybersecurity in civil and commercial space. It is a continuation of long-standing bipartisan oversight. Last year, the committee and space subcommittee chairs and ranking members jointly asked GAO to review NASA and NASA contract cybersecurity, and we look forward to reviewing that work very soon. The executive branch is also focused on space cybersecurity issues. In September of 2020, the Trump administration issued Space Policy Directive Number 5, which outlined the U.S. government's first cybersecurity policy for space systems. Earlier this spring, the Department of Homeland Security updated their space policy for the first time since 2011. Last year, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, announced the formation of a space systems critical infrastructure working group to bring together stakeholders from across the sector to minimize risk to space systems. Industry coalitions are emerging to provide private sector information sharing and collaboration without government intervention. And last but not least, NIST continues to provide world-class services and standards, as they have done since the 1970s on cybersecurity. All of these activities promote a bottoms-up approach to private sector cybersecurity issues that are focused on information sharing rather than proscriptive regulations. This is the correct path, as it ensures the industry remains at the cutting edge of innovation rather than generations behind our adversaries like China. As we continue our bipartisan oversight of this important topic, we should also reach out to space operators, launch providers, prime contractors, component subcontractors, software providers, antenna and ground station operators, and even end users to ensure that we understand the breadth of this topic. This will help inform how Congress responds to future questions, such as whether space should be listed as an additional critical infrastructure protection sector. This is a complex question. Many aspects of space are already covered by other sectors like communications, defense industrial base, critical manufacturing, information technology, government facilities, emergency services, financial services, and even food and agriculture. Some space activities, like suborbital tourism, may not rise to the definition of critical. For this reason, both the Trump and Biden administrations have chosen not to add space as an additional sector, instead focusing on critical functions. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and continuing our conversation on how we as a nation can best secure our space cyber domain while also maintaining our leadership in space commerce. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Dr. Babin, thank you very much. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Dr. Theresa Suloway is a space cyber subject matter expert at the MITRE Corporation. Dr. Suloway previously served as the department manager at the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center at MITRE, sponsored by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST. She worked with NIST on developing several NIST interagency reports on commercial space, and also serves as an alternate board member to the Space Information Sharing Working Group. Dr. Suloway has 15 years of technical experience in the DoD and the U.S. intelligence community, guiding R&D and operational activities. So, Dr. Suloway, welcome. Dr. Matthew Scholl, who's with us virtually, is the chief of the Computer Security Division in the Information Technology Laboratory at the U.S. Department of Commerce, NIST. Mr. Scholl oversees a research program that cultivates trust in information technology and metrics by developing and disseminating standards, measurements, and testing for interoperability, security, usability, and reliability of information systems, including cybersecurity standards and guidelines for federal agencies and U.S. industry. He also co-leads NIST's participation with the Cybersecurity National and International Standards Development Organization. He's a U.S. Army veteran and currently has more than 20 years of federal service. Welcome, Mr. Scholl. Finally, Mr. Brandon Bailey is a senior cybersecurity project manager within the cybersecurity subdivision at Aerospace Corporation. Mr. Bailey has spent much of his professional career supporting space agencies such as NASA, where he led various cybersecurity efforts. More recently, Mr. Bailey has published several articles and reports focusing on adding cybersecurity into space systems to meet the evolving threat landscape, including a set of products that define risk-driven requirements. So, Mr. Bailey, welcome. As our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony, which could be much longer, will be included in the record for the hearing. When you've all completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with the difficult questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We will start with Dr. Theresa Suloway. Dr. Suloway, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Babin, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you on commercial space cybersecurity. Successful adoption of cybersecurity in the commercial space industry is a critically important issue, and I appreciate the opportunity to share insights from my work on this topic. My name is Theresa Suloway. I am a space and cybersecurity engineer and project lead with MITRE. My testimony today comes from my 15 years of technical experience working at MITRE and in the industry guiding research and development and operational activities across government. I also serve as an active member of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or ISAC. My role with MITRE has involved support to NIST's National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center. This FFRDC administers NIST's National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or NCCOE, which MITRE has operated since 2014. I would like to make a brief statement and to submit my full remarks for the record. When discussing space systems, it is useful to divide the landscape into 3 manageable, distinct components: the user segment, the ground segment, and the space segment. The user segment is the community that uses the services that the satellite provides, such as global navigation systems, for example, GPS, and internet services. The ground segment is defined by the infrastructure that supports the tasking and operation of the satellites and its payloads, including the computer networks, antennas, and industrial control systems that support transmission to the satellite. The space segment represents the satellite that is in orbit. NIST has published interagency reports to address each segment, which I co-authored in my role with MITRE. The NIST cybersecurity framework consists of 5 core functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, all applicable to the space domain. First, we must identify the risks and vulnerabilities to the space ecosystem. For example, one of the most urgent cybersecurity risks that must be addressed for commercial space is the possibility that one or more satellites could be hijacked to cause a collision. A collision between satellites would not only destroy the satellites involved, but the resulting debris would permanently remove that orbit or region from use by any other satellite. This risk requires preemptive rather than reactive action. As dependence on commercial space services grow, our critical infrastructure is exposed to further cascading risks, from our nation's food supply to hospital communications to energy delivery. Rural locations, which are solely dependent on commercial satellite connectivity, are at higher risks if these services are disrupted. The ground segment is vulnerable because it is the easiest to access through traditional means. While harder to access, the space segment is vulnerable to corrupted commands or software being sent from either a trusted or malicious source. Adding encryption to the ground space link would mitigate some of the vulnerabilities by making it harder for malicious sources to send commands to the satellites. An attacker can be successful regardless of the measures you put in place, making monitoring key. Monitoring and cyber situational awareness need to be built in now as part of the fabric of commercial space. You can't respond to and recover from an attack you're unaware of. The commercial space industry operates within the constraints of size, weight, power, and cost, and needs to serve both customers and investors. Introducing burdensome, potentially costly cyber requirements into this already high-risk, high-cost environment without a full understanding of the impacts of those requirements could force companies to move their operations abroad, affecting our nation's standing as a leader in this burgeoning domain. Based on my experiences and observations, I recommend the committee consider the following actions. Incentivize adoption of best practices by investing in R&D for cybersecurity technologies for space systems. If only one requirement is applied, ensure that it is encryption and encryption modules that can upgrade to post-quantum algorithms. Formalize and strengthen the government's relationship with the Space ISAC. In addition, incentivize commercial space companies to share information with the Space ISAC. The Space ISAC's Watch Center, coming online in Q4 of this year, could provide both government and industry with needed awareness. Consideration should be given to the designation of space systems as critical infrastructure, which would provide additional emphasis to the cybersecurity and resilience of civil and commercial space systems. I remain committed to the success, safety, and growth of the commercial space domain through my work at MITRE and the Space ISAC, with academia and private industry. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come before you today and to provide my insights, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Suloway, thank you very much. Let me now introduce Mr. Matthew Scholl from NIST.
Chairman Beyer, Ranking Member Babin, and members of the subcommittee, I am Matthew Scholl, Chief of the Computer Security Division at NIST. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. NIST is the home to 5 Nobel Prize winners, with programs focused on our nation's priorities, such as AI, advanced manufacturing, the digital economy, precision metrology, quantum sciences, biosciences, and of course, cybersecurity. In the area of cybersecurity, NIST has worked with our partners since 1972 when we published the data encryption standard. NIST's role is to provide standards, guidance, tools, data references, and testing methods that protect our nation's information and information systems. As stated in the 2021 U.S. Space Priorities Framework, access to and use of space is of a vital national interest. However, cyber-related threats to space assets pose increasing risk to the commercial space emerging market. Space is a high-risk environment, so cybersecurity risks involving commercial space needs to be understood and managed to ensure safe and successful operations. Physical risks to space are generally quantifiable and have the most likely potential to adversely impact businesses that operate commercial satellites. While physical risks are generally the primary risk, Continued growth in commercial space operation allows us the opportunity to address cybersecurity risks as well. As mentioned earlier, Space Policy Directive 5, the Cybersecurity Principles for Space Systems, has established some key principles for cybersecurity in space. And it states that space systems are reliant on information systems and networks from design through launch and flight operations. These systems can be vulnerable to malicious activity. That includes spoofing of sensor data, corrupting sensor systems, jamming and sending unauthorized commands for guidance and control, the injection of malicious code, and conducting denial of service attacks. In order to assist with the need to address these issues, NIST has taken some actions. Now, NIST is not a space agency, but rather a measurement and metrology agency with a long history in cybersecurity. We provide our expertise to mission owners, like space operators, where we couple our cybersecurity experience and expertise with their understanding and context of the mission area in order to create our applicable and effective resources. These resources include a foundational PNT profile, applying cybersecurity framework for the responsible use of position, navigation, and timing services. Executive Order 13905, strengthening our nation's resilience through responsible use of position, navigation, and timing services, directed NIST to develop this cybersecurity profile to assist with managing risks to systems that are dependent on PNT services. We also created the Introduction to Cybersecurity for Commercial Satellite Operations. This guidance provides a general introduction to cybersecurity risk management for commercial satellite operators. While it's not intended to be comprehensive, it presents basic concepts and provides sample references for additional information on cybersecurity risk management for use by this industry. We also created the Satellite Ground Segment, applying the cybersecurity framework to assure satellite command and control. This guidance addresses risks specifically to the ground segment of space operations. It defines the ground segment and its components and presents mappings to relevant cybersecurity informative references to assist in the management of risk to this part of space operations. NIST also works with our partners and has co-hosted a series of external events, for example, the Space Cybersecurity Symposium series. NIST, working with the Department of Commerce's Office of Space Commerce and the Department of Homeland Security, worked together on a series of jointly hosted symposiums where we learn and share information about the latest cyber threats to space infrastructure. We learn from the industry's cybersecurity experiences. We hear about their needs and their acceptable mitigation strategies. Commercial space operations and opportunities continue to grow and provide an engine for our economy and expand our understanding of the world and the universe. This emerging nature of commercial space technologies gives us this new opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss NIST activities today, and I am pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Mr. Scholl, thank you very much. We'll now hear from Mr. Brandon Bailey, a NASA veteran and now with the Aerospace Corporation. Mr. Bailey?
Thank you. Chairman Byer, Ranking Member Babin, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to join the discussion. Within the last decade, Aerospace Corporation has been performing analysis and research on space system cybersecurity to protect against an evolving threat landscape. I've personally spent the majority of my 16-year career focusing on cybersecurity issues with commercial and civilian space systems. My submitted written testimony goes into much more detail, but I would like to cover several aspects within this testimony describing the current gaps in relation to cybersecurity of space technology. There's a critical need to protect space technology, which could lead to creating critical infrastructure sector for space technology. There's currently disjointed oversight and governance of cybersecurity in addition to the lack of binding space cyber policy or widely adopted technical standards for commercial space, which is lagging behind the growth of the cyber threat. There continues to be significant gaps in technical cybersecurity solutions, technical-oriented standards and best practices for space technology, as well as a lack of cybersecurity information sharing and research and development for space technology, as many efforts within space cyber are siloed and fragmented. This lack of research and information sharing has led to a significant lack of security-focused defensive capabilities on board the satellites. There continues to be too much existing focus on the ground segment protections to limit access to the satellite. The release of Space Policy Directive 5 in September 2020 and the fact we're having this hearing testifies to the importance of space technology and cybersecurity. Space Policy Directive 5 stated that space systems contribute to the operation of the nation's critical infrastructure, and when leveraging Presidential Policy Directive 521's definition for critical infrastructure, it's unquestionable that there is space technology that qualify for this definition. Space technology is important for industry and government activity, as well as everyday people activities. In fact, according to the Department of Homeland Security, all 55 of the national critical functions have some sort of dependency or enabled by space technology. However, simply stating thou shalt be a critical sector without proper planning on implementation could ultimately lead to creating unnecessary bureaucracy that could stifle the innovation that is necessary to ensure the United States remains the leader in space-based capabilities, along with it being secure. The space technology sector must contend with harsh environmental conditions of space, accommodate strict size, weight, and power constraints for operating in space. Therefore, ensuring a proper sector risk management agency is selected, along with support from other applicable federal departments, agencies, and space domain aware entities who understand the nuance of cybersecurity in addition to the space environment will be crucial to the successful implementation of identifying space technology as a critical infrastructure sector. If done properly, having a space domain knowledgeable governance structure can help establish better cybersecurity standards and sharing of information across the community. It has been openly communicated by the Defense Intelligence Agency that adversarial nations plan to target the United States space technology via cyber means. And we're entering into an era of space-based capabilities that are not driven by government, therefore do not fall under existing regulation nor governance. With this rapid commercialization of space-based capabilities, government-owned assets are no longer the only space system being targeted by adversaries. As was witnessed during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, cyber attacks have no boundaries and commercial entities will be targeted as well. Security considerations and solutions must be established as the United States continues to leverage commercial capabilities to augment or replace traditionally provided government space-based capabilities. The United States cannot simply hope for the best when it comes to security on commercial space systems. Action is needed to ensure commercial space systems have been built securely using threat-informed, risk-based engineering. It is also imperative that these security principles are flowed down appropriately through subsidiaries in the supply chain. One recent effort to fill standards and best practices gap was through the government agency-sponsored publicly releasable technical operator report by the Aerospace Corporation. This report documented a threat-informed risk mitigation strategy to protect satellites. The report, titled Cybersecurity Protections for Spacecraft, a Threat-Based Approach, provides government and industry a background on space cyber security and the state of existing standards, the concept of technical defense and depth protection necessary to protect satellites, and the threat-oriented approach to space cyber risk assessment. This report has been submitted as a part of the record with this testimony. In summary, the need to protect space technology is very apparent. Therefore, we need to foster a whole of government solution, working with industry to establish proper guardrails, creating binding policy and a new critical infrastructure sector for space technology, and leveraging the space cyber aware federal agencies and entities like the Information Sharing and Analysis Center to improve cyber across the board will be imperative. The government sector has knowledge on how to protect space-based capabilities, but we need to foster better information sharing across the board. The United States needs to work towards a global consensus through stronger collaboration among space system manufacturers, suppliers, owners, and operators. Information sharing to the entire space technology sector about threats, vulnerabilities, corrective action is a must, which can lead to improved security across all segments of the space architecture. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on this important topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Bailey, thank you very much. We'll now begin a round of questions. I first want to make sure that you're not discouraged that there's not a full dais up here. You know, when Congress goes out, the House goes out tomorrow, in theory, for 5 or 6 weeks. So everyone's packing everything into those last days, and especially with the huge CHIPS and Science 2022 bill, which is dramatic in so many different ways, and which theory will be coming for a vote later today. But please know that there were tens of thousands of people watching on C-SPAN across the country, and many, this is on TV in many offices across the Hill right now. And hopefully more people will come up to ask questions. Otherwise, Brian and Mr. Posey and I will grill you for a long time. Dr. Suloway, let me start with you. You meant three following actions. One was the incentivized adoption of best practices. And you specifically said encryption modules that can upgrade to post-quantum algorithms. Do the encryption modules exist right now that at industrial scale that can be adopted by the commercial and the government users? And since no one's broke through on the quantum algorithms yet, I don't think, how do you ensure that your encryption is going to be upgradable when you don't know how the quantum computing is yet going to work?
Thank you for the question. So as far as the need for encryption, there are often software-only encryption systems that you can deploy on your satellite, so you wouldn't have to physically buy a piece of hardware and put it on your satellite. You would still need to be able to support the compute functions of that encryption software. From a perspective of post-quantum encryption, the algorithms have actually already are being published by NIST, and so there are some of these available. I think the concern with the post-quantum encryption and why I put that in my testimony is because we want to be able to upgrade in the future. So satellites being launched cannot be physically altered once they're in space, and so the driver to try and get the capability in there, even if the technologies aren't available yet.
Yeah, we've had a lot of hearings in this committee on blockchain, for example, which is just fascinating until you realize that blockchain's strength and impenetrability may go away right away once quantum computing happens. But by the way, we're all a little intimidated by a PhD in aeronautics and applied physics at Caltech, you know. Almost nothing more needs to be said. Mr. Scholl, you talk about how NIST did the introduction to cybersecurity, a bunch of really interesting things that NIST has done. And it says that the introduction has to move to the next big place, which is actual standards. Will NIST develop that? Or are they the best people to develop it? And when do we go from just sort of suggesting here's a way to approach to actually mandating or laying out the very clear guidance needs that both the commercial and the government sector have to take? When do we move from an introduction to something that's actually real?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the intent of the document that we wrote on the introduction was to lay out the process steps that an individual organization will walk through in order to make it real for the technologies that they're using, for the type of space operation that they're working under, either purely owned or outsourced or maybe some hybrid, as well as for the context of their business. Now, these all have wide variations and many differences. So our initial document was to introduce how an organization works through that risk management process to develop something that's real and that will be meaningful for their business and their mission to assure what their operations need to secure. The next steps then are to ensure that individual organizations really understand how to implement these processes, and then potentially for us to work in an open standards body alongside industry to develop those next step things. So not necessarily NIST internally, but now externally in a participative standards body alongside industry to grind out the next level of detail.
Thank you, Mr. Scholl. Mr. Bailey, let me pivot on almost just follow up to that question. You talk about the lack of a binding space cyber policy for commercial space technology, and the Directive 5 exists, but it's non-binding. Can it be? Can we get a binding policy, cyber policy for space, for commercial and non-commercial? And is NIST the folks to develop that? Or is it aerospace?
Thanks for your question. So I think we can create some binding level of policy to some degree based on there's definitely some minimum standard type of implementation for security that we could look to leverage. And Space Policy Directive 5 actually hints to many of those principles that no one would disagree with that are good and could be binding, but it's like I said, it's non-binding, so you can't really force people to do it. Now, a majority of people that are developing these systems, commercial and government, are doing many of the things that are listed in Space Policy Directive 5, but it's not necessarily a requirement. So there are some level, and NIST could be helpful, as well as some of the communities that are popping up within, like the Space ISAC, for instance, could help drive some of those policy implementation details, as well as aerospace being an FFRDC could help and assist with that as well. Because there definitely are some minimum standard things I think we could get into a policy document.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me now recognize the ranking member of the Space Subcommittee, Dr. Brian Babin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question to all witnesses, and thank you for being here with us. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, is the primary federal agency tasked with addressing the cybersecurity of our nation's critical infrastructure. In May of 2021, CISA announced the formation of a Space Systems Critical Infrastructure Working Group to bring together stakeholders from across the whole sector to minimize risk to space systems. And just a short answer, if you don't mind, how are each of you working with CISA on this effort? Let's start with Mr. Scholl.
Yeah, certainly. So I have attended some of those meetings and discussed cybersecurity standards and tools that NIST has that could be applicable to space operations with this working group. But in general, we have an extensive partnership and collaboration with the DHS, the National Risk Management Center, mostly through their Space Weather and Space Risk organization in the NMRC. So even outside of this specific working group, we do collaborate and work extensively with DHS, who is focused on this issue.
Okay, Mr. Bailey.
Yeah, the Aerospace Corporation is involved in those those working groups and meetings. So there is involvement there from the Aerospace Corporation side of the house. I've yet to see necessarily any output from that organization quite yet to understand what their what the goal will be in the end and how it's going to affect change in the future. But there is involvement with aerospace in that group.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Soloway.
Yes, we're supporting, I am supporting the CISA working group, as well as one of the sub-working groups that is publishing a paper either end of this month or early next month around how to further the work from the NIST profiles that have been published within CISA. So that work is coming, and there's a lot of debate in that working group on the adoption of the critical infrastructure as a sector. So I think there are reports going to be published in the next few months.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Scholl, the smaller companies in the space launch industry may not be familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, but it's been a sector that NIST is focused on through the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, the CCOE. How is NIST engaging the space sector during the current process to update the new cybersecurity framework 2.0?
That's a great question. And so we've done some active and targeted outreach to some of these communities, especially, as you said, small space operators, to ensure that we understand and get their feedback on the usability of the framework for their mission areas. And we reach out to both individual companies as well as through organizations like the Satellite Industry Association, which helps us bring them together into one organization, and then also amplifies our message back out to their members as well. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has also been extremely helpful in reaching this community for us as well.
Okay, and then once again there, Mr. Scholl, in May 2021, President Biden signed an executive order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity. As part of the EO, the executive order, NIST was tasked with identifying ways to increase the security of software supply chains, which will be incorporated into new federal acquisition regulation for federal contacts moving forward. In a July 2022 update, NIST indicated that it needs to continue to work to review the proposed FAR regulations to ensure they are consistent with the requirements of the executive order. What is the status of this work, and when do you expect these FAR regulations to be released, and what's the expected timeline for compliance?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So NIST has published a series of guidance, recommendations, and tools to improve the security of our software supply chain. The publication and the update of the federal acquisition regulation of the FAR is not the NIST responsibility within the executive order, but rather will be conducted by GSA, who has oversight on the FAR. And the implementation of that will come down through the Office of Management and Budget in policy directives to the agencies writ large. NIST has built the foundation in the guidance and the directives that will be used to both commercial and government software developers that both the FAR and the policy will cite for those requirements. So we've laid the foundations and the groundwork. Now the organizations that have responsibility for government-wide policy and for acquisition regulation will be the next step, and those are external to NIST.
Okay, thank you very much. My time is expended, so I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Dr. Babin, thank you very much. Let me now recognize the member of Congress whose district will oversee the Artemis launch to the moon in the next 60 days or so. Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. It seems the threats to our national security never end. They just get greater and greater. And I thank the panelists for coming today and sharing your thoughts with us. The vast majority of space technologies are dual use, meaning they can serve both a national security and a civil purpose. Companies like L3 Harris, which is headquartered in my district, offer solutions to protect government systems. Many other companies manufacture, launch, and offer solutions to protect them as well. Are there any barriers that any of you see between the cybersecurity solutions provided for national security, civil, and commercial space sectors?
I'll jump in here. So one of the things I see is the barrier for information sharing between government, national security, and commercial. So there's been numerous times where I've been involved in conversations where they kind of have to stop because the proper caveats or access control and information can't be shared with certain commercial entities for certain reasons. So so that leads to not understanding the threat necessarily as well as maybe national security individuals may have. So that can lead to a misrepresentation, misunderstanding of what kind of threat they're actually trying to mitigate. So there definitely needs to be some breaking down the barriers there, getting some information sharing at the highest levels to individuals who need it. So the engineers and implementers that are actually doing the system engineering need that information.
Do you see that there is a potential solution to the problem?
Yeah, there could be sponsoring access to certain contractors to build these solutions, or temporary clearances for individuals, which they've done that in the past at certain levels, like getting read on to certain accesses for a certain meeting or something like that. So opening up that information flow. But I think one avenue that could potentially help is with the stand up in the last couple of years with the Space ISAC. There could be an avenue to get information distributed out to a wider community who are members of that community. However, it has to be certain things have to be done with the information to make it shareable, and work needs to be done. So having someone to handle that part, to get the information declassified or demarked down to a certain level that can be shared will be critical.
Great, that's a great answer. Again, to anyone on the panel, how are you working with the aerospace and defense sector to ensure government use applications have cyber protections built into the requirements?
So I actually have an answer to the previous question on barriers for DoD and civil and commercial. In my view, the DoD and civil agencies which have requirements are able to fund the the addition of security measures to their satellites. But for commercial vendors, they are driven by the consumers of the services that are being used. And so they may not be as willing to pay for security as a DoD or a civil agency would because they're required to do so. So I think it's important to remember that solely commercial entities won't have the ability to be competitive with other entities that don't include security if that's not somehow incentivized by the government to do so.
That makes perfect sense. Do you see solutions to that?
I think when it comes to cybersecurity, the NCCUE has been able to help private industry adopt cybersecurity without a lot of additional costs by developing practice guides that show commercial entities that do the R&D to integrate security tools into a reference architecture to help kind of lower that entry into using commercially available cybersecurity products. And so I think similar R&D and guides that can help the commercial space community adopt without having to do a lot of experimentation and to implement cybersecurity tools would be helpful. So guides and additional references would help.
I see my time has expired, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, to yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. Let me now introduce the Chair of the House Administration Committee, Ms. Lofgren.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the committee. I think this is an extremely important hearing, and I'm grateful that we have organized it. You know, when you think about the space sector, the commercial side may not have the same protections that we have in the governmental side, and yet a cyber attack could be simply devastating to the American economy and to the world economy. So this is hugely important. I'm wondering, especially since it looks like we will be taking up the CHIP Act today, we know in other sectors that supply chains and third-party vendors can present significant cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So how much do we need to worry in the space system supply chains posing cybersecurity risks, and what should we do about it? I mean, one of the concerns that's been raised publicly, I won't get into any of our classified briefings, but Huawei's vulnerability is well known or has been publicly discussed. We hope to overcome that through the CHIPS Act. Can any of you address that?
At least from my perspective, cybersecurity, the supply chain risks that you would have in space systems, as you would in any other industry, are going to be there, and there are a few things you can do. But I think monitoring your systems, because you are not going to be able to fully vet every single line of code that you could be bringing into your environment. So again, monitoring and sharing information, as Mr. Bailey mentioned earlier, is important to do for the commercial space industry in general, especially because, especially for space systems, it's harder to deal with things once systems are in orbit. So monitoring is really important.
Correct.
So-
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, if I may, yeah, information security, information supply chain risk management is a hugely important field, which has shown itself even more so after the Log4j vulnerability issue in SolarWinds. And so there's been a significant focus that can and should be applied to the supply chain and commercial satellites as well. This technology, though, has the potential to be monitored and managed a little tighter just because of the desire and the need for technologies that have a space pedigree. This is not necessarily a technology space that's as wide as commercial off-the-shelf technologies that are used in our IT systems. It's a smaller set. They have to survive the violence of launch and the environments of space. So people look for technologies that are specialized for that. So there's an opportunity here to understand and provide visibility into a supply chain.
I can say one thing real quick. So I agree with what Mr. Scholl said. However, on the commercialization of space that we're seeing and the influx is you are starting to see a little more commoditized standard technology that's being used and open source software that's being used that we haven't seen in the past. So I think the supply chain aspect is going to be of increasing importance with the commercialization of space, because now you're seeing entities run like real-time Linux on spacecraft, where before you would never see that. And then you have the ASIC FPGA hardware-based Trojan things that can happen if you're offshore those and don't have those under a good lock and key. So it's going to be increased importance for sure.
I thank all of the witnesses, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Ms. Lofgren, thank you so very much. We're now going to do a second round of questions for those members who would wish to do so. Let me begin. Dr. Soloway, you had mentioned, I think Mr. Bailey mentioned also, that designating space systems as a critical infrastructure sector within DHS, that there are 16 existing already. Our good friend Congressman Ted Lieu from California had actually introduced legislation specifically to do that, which is not yet passed. Is this the right way to go? And how big a priority should this be for us?
There are several aspects to having space as a critical infrastructure, and I think the advantages of having it as a space as a critical infrastructure allows there to be a focused location for commercial entities to kind of engage with the federal government. I know there is also a lot of concern that it would add additional burden to the commercial space industry, and that's why some people are concerned about bringing it as an additional sector. And so I think whatever is done, centralized focus is important, and the implementation of it needs to be done carefully so that it doesn't have the opposite effect of driving commercial entities to not work within the United States and register abroad. So I think that's my only concern.
You lied very nicely into the second question. Of the three recommendations you made, the first one was that we incentivize adoption to best practices rather than regulate them. Is this the same concern, that they would locate in other countries if we regulated?
Yeah, that's the main concern, is that we want them to be part of the conversation, and as Brandon mentioned, from a space information sharing perspective, we want them to bring their data into the fold so that the community itself can get stronger. But if commercial entities who have to serve customers aren't able to be profitable with adding in additional requirements, that's an issue. I will say the space community, at least the ones that participate with the ISAC, are very motivated to be involved and are applying their resources. So I just want to protect that community and with whatever is done from a critical infrastructure perspective.
Mr. Bailey, let me pile on, because this is a constant debate here is how light, how heavy should the regulatory touch be? So if we're in a place where we're encouraging, based on NIST recommendations, and not mandating, not having a set policy, what's the danger of the bad actors slipping through in some 5%, 10%, 20% of the cases? How do we find that right balance?
Yeah, I think incentivizing is one mechanism. Maybe there's a balance between minimum implementation standard like encryption or maybe some supply chain controls as minimum, and then incentivize to increase maybe additional levels of security. And it's not a one size fits all either. It's not every single satellite that gets launched needs a certain level of security. You know, it's a risk-based decision. And so anything that's being leveraged to provide critical functionality for the country should meet, you know, these minimum standards. But maybe, you know, small research CubeSats or nanosats that are running for universities may not have to be the same level of security. So it's going to have to be a risk-based decision. And as these things get used for critical functions in the country, I think the barrier and the minimum standard has to be established because, I mean, at a minimum, what we've already, I mean, encryption is super important. I think we all agree that it should be done. And the fact that we don't have that as a binding requirement for any satellite that's launched in this country is a little concerning from my perspective.
Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Suloway, you talked about formalizing and strengthening the government's relationship with Space ISAC. Tell us a little bit more about Space ISAC. Is it governmental, quasi-governmental, private?
It's a private company, but they do have a relationship with DHS, so they're chartered by. I think they have a relationship of information sharing with DHS, but right now they don't have a formal federal government role, and I think that's where there can be confusion from a commercial space perspective of where, if they wanted information, where do they plug in? Do they go to the FBI, or do they go to DHS, or, you know, should they participate with the Space ISAC? It's I think it would help to formalize that relationship so commercial companies could feel comfortable providing that information and know that they were plugging into the appropriate part of the ecosystem, because there isn't a central, I think, location to go to.
Okay, thank you. If Dr. Babin is here, I don't believe he is, but Dr. Babin, if you were here, we'd love to welcome you for a second round of questions. So moving on, Dr. Soloway, let me also just follow up on that. ISAC, Space ISAC is nonprofit?
I believe it is a nonprofit, but I do not know that off the top of my head. I would have to get back to you.
And how would the government formalize this relationship with ISAC?
So that is a good question. I am not as familiar with how the federal government formalizes relationships with ISAC, and so I would have to get back with you on what the specific mechanism would be for that.
Mr. Bailey, if I could just pivot on the same question. You talked about a proper sector-specific agency, SSA, Sector Risk Management Agency, working with something like ISAC. Is this something, again, that's created from scratch based on an earlier model? Or does it already exist?
Well, the real intent in that comment was ensuring that we select the proper, sector agency and not affiliate it with maybe agencies who aren't necessarily or can't tap into the space domain knowledge that does exist in the federal space. Because currently we have, between NASA, Space Force, NRO, NOAA, that we have numerous agencies, professionals, and people who understand this domain and understand cybersecurity concerns and the nuance thereof. So the real crux of that comment is really ensuring that we leverage those agencies in addition to the community that the ISAC is building with the commercial sector to implement that properly. So what you don't want is, necessarily some bureaucratic agency that has little to domain awareness that, relegates, a little bunch of red tape that just stifles innovation. So that's really the goal, is making sure that you have the proper bounds of oversight with people who have domain expertise, and then working directly with entities like the ISAC to further the cybersecurity posture and improve it across the board. So if we were to do the critical sector, critical space technology is a critical infrastructure sector, whoever that agency is, that's probably where you could have that tie-in with the ISAC and have that kind of point-to-point communication, in my opinion.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bailey, very much. Let me yield to a good friend, the ranking member, Dr. Babin, for his questions. In the meantime, Congresswoman Kim will follow Dr. Babin.
Thank you very much. I wasn't quick enough to get my audio back on. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do have a couple more questions. This one to Dr. Soloway. How does MITRE support small and medium-sized businesses in the space industry on cybersecurity standards and best practices? And how does MITRE work to explain what the attack framework is to the commercial space industry?
So MITRE works with several industry associations like AIAA and engages with them on that front. As far as MITRE attack, there isn't a specific MITRE attack for space systems, but we do provide the MITRE attack framework because generally to all. So we are engaging heavily in forums and conferences with the commercial space community, which is actually where we've heard a lot of the concerns from a regulatory perspective. And so those are the engagements we've had. And yes, MITRE attack is helpful, but it's important to remember MITRE attack is based on tactics, techniques, and procedures that have been observed in other systems. And there hasn't, you guys have mentioned several of the incidents that have occurred for space systems, but there isn't that large body of knowledge as there are with traditional network systems. And so there's a lot of, I guess, predictive nature of looking at attack and how it could apply to space systems because there isn't that knowledge base.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. And one more, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind. This is addressed to Mr. Bailey. Information sharing and analysis centers, or ISACs, are forums for private sector information sharing related to critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. According to the National Council of ISACs, they are typically nonprofit organizations which do not lobby. I think you all mentioned that a second ago. A new ISAC focused on space was recently established, and both Aerospace and MITRE are members. Is the Space ISAC a nonprofit, and does it advocate for policy positions?
I also don't know 100% for sure if it is nonprofit, but I believe that is the case given the how ISACs operate. And yes, Aerospace and MITRE, and we support the ISAC, and we don't really lobby for anything. We necessarily put out what we feel like is the appropriate guidance or position that the ISAC would want to have as it relates to cybersecurity. So one of the things that we've done in the ISAC community that we're currently working on, we haven't published anything yet, but is trying to translate Space Policy Directive 5 from a policy, even though it's non-binding, to implementation details that can actually be shared in the community. So that's an ongoing effort. There's a Space Policy Directive 5 working group where we're trying to better articulate some implementation technical guidance as it relates to the principles that were outlined in SPD 5. So that's kind of where we're more in the nuts and bolts area of this, but there is some policy aspect of that.
Okay.
And if I could answer the question you had before. So the question you asked before about how MITRE supports, so Aerospace does similar activities. With our focus is space. So MITRE does a lot of their great work with attack and other things. Aerospace is really focused mostly on space systems. And the way we collaborate with industry and things is like we've published a technical operator report this year with a coordination through a government agency to get it in the public sector so that it can be shared to commercial entities on the threats that could apply to a spacecraft, as well as countermeasures and ways to implement those and even get those into acquisition requirements and design details. So we're trying to put out additional low-level guidance that can help mitigate some of the cyber attack threats that we see that could manifest itself on board a vehicle. And we also have initiatives ongoing that try to leverage what the MITRE attack framework is, but kind of translate that for what it would really mean to a space vehicle. And we have ongoing research in that area. Over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Excellent. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back and I appreciate the second round.
Thank you, Mr. Babin, very much. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from California, Mr. Kim, Ms. Kim.
Thank you, Chairman Beyer and Ranking Member Babin, for holding this hearing today. And I do appreciate the opportunity to ask our witnesses questions in the second round. Space already plays a very integral part in our lives, and with the commercial space boom we have witnessed in recent years, we should expect that our lives will be increasingly reliant on technology in Earth's orbit. This means we'll be increasingly reliant on cybersecurity. So I can ask this question to either Dr. Suloway or Dr. Shore. In your written testimony, Dr. Shore, you noted that examples of malicious cyber activities harmful to space operations include spoofing sensor data, corrupting sensor systems, jamming or sending unauthorized commands for guidance and control, injecting malicious code, and conducting denial of service attacks. This is what you said, Mr. Shore. So based on your experience of working with the private sector to implement Space Policy Directive 5, would you say malign state actors are the greatest threat to America's commercial space industry?
So, yeah, thank you for the question. Nation-state actors are one of the most resourced and motivated to disrupt this this infrastructure of the threat actors that exist. So certainly a nation-state actor has the resources, has the capability, and has the need from a competitive perspective as a threat actor that we should be prioritizing.
Sure.
A lot of these attacks are described absent of the actual threat actor. A tier down is the potential authorized and person who has access, but for whom there's an accidental input, a disruption, an interference with an adjacent band. So yes, nation-state actors first, but there's also a whole other class of threat actors which are known as the accidental but authorized as well.
Sure. For the past year, our committee has worked on legislation to increase the number of graduates entering STEM fields, including cybersecurity. So I want to ask you, Dr. Suloway, what is your assessment of the cybersecurity workforce in the space industry and in the federal government's space agencies?
So it is a challenge to find individuals with both a space background and a cyber background. And I think just anecdotally, it is hard to get both of those backgrounds together in a single person. So more investment in education would be helpful.
Sure. Dr. Suloway, are you aware of any state-sponsored cyber attacks on American commercial space companies? And if so, what was the damage that you were aware of?
So I can speak to the two recent events that Chairman Beyer brought up in his testimony, which were the SpaceX terminals in Ukraine, as well as the Viasat. So from a Viasat perspective, it's interesting because the attackers were able to get in from the ground system and then move to the user terminals and then disable those systems. So it's interesting from a ground user space, getting into one allows you to pivot to the other. In that case, they disabled the terminals, which were able to be recovered at a later state, but disrupted the service. So it was recoverable, but I don't know the full impact of what wasn't able to be done without that service.
So I know the last question you asked, you responded, and I wanted to just see what kind of attacks that you were aware of, and if so. But I do agree with you that we lack workforce in the STEM-related field, and I think that is the more reason why our government has to invest more in educating the next generation of future scientists, future, the workforce in the STEM field. So I know I'm working on legislation collectively with my colleagues, one of which was already included in the CHIPS legislation that we're working on this week. So I really agree that we need to build our workforce in that development, and I'm really using this time to encourage my colleagues to think through it as we vote on that legislation today. Thank you.
Congresswoman Kim, thank you very much for coming and being part of this. Before we bring the hearing to the close, I really want to thank our witnesses for your testimony. As I understand, there are roughly 4,500 satellites in low Earth orbit today. They project 100,000 by the year 2030, which is not far away. We're depending on them for communications, for weather, for agriculture, for national security, and probably most importantly for the internet for the whole world. And it's critical for life in the 21st century that we protect the satellites and the ground-to-satellite, satellite-to-ground communication. So this is a really important hearing. Thank you so much for all of your input. Thanks for the ideas and the wisdom. We will try to figure out a way forward with your help. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members and for any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused. The hearing is now adjourned.
Thank you.